Hello, hello, everyone. It looks like we're at the top of the hour, so we can get started. Welcome this evening to tonight's topic, which is the science of satiety, what keeps us fuller longer. And this topic can get very involved, very in the weeds. I did my best to try and keep it simple, but also interesting and hopefully helpful for you when you're trying to find out the foods that can help keep us full, and also how different hormones in our body also can affect our levels of fullness. So let's get started. As always, like I like to emphasize every week, it is the quality of your calories that matters. And we can see that here as well, because there will be some calories, some foods that have a stronger effect on satiety than others. And I'm sure you can already guess it's going to be the nutrient-dense, high-fiber foods, high-protein foods that tend to be the better players when it comes to all of this. So what we'll cover this evening is a brief definition of satiety, just to get a baseline there. We'll talk about appetite regulation and GLP-1 medications, as well as the hormone that naturally occurs in our body. I'll touch a little bit on foods that influence satiety, and also how some of our eating habits can affect our levels of fullness, or any eating habits we can adopt to help us continue to feel fuller longer, even if we're not taking GLP-1 medications. And as always, I like to leave time and room for your questions at the end. So feel free to interject with questions, hitting the button at the bottom left-hand screen, and I'd be happy to answer those. So let's define satiety. It might seem pretty understandable. It is the feeling of being full after eating, or essentially no more feelings of hunger or the need to eat. Because I don't want anyone to think that satiety means that it's that feeling of uncomfortably full. It's just, I'm satisfied. I don't need to eat. I don't feel that drive for hunger. And it is part of appetite regulation, actually. There's sort of this cycle of appetite where you've got your hunger, you've got the satiation, the eating, if you will, and then the satiety. And that's a cycle that we all experience throughout the day, throughout the weeks, etc. And satiety can be influenced by many factors. So some of them are by hormones, especially our gut hormones, and also our stomach being stretched, or you might hear it referred to as maybe gastric distension after eating. And that has to do with, a lot of times, the types of foods we're eating can influence that amount of stretching that you might experience. So firstly, we're going to touch on the hormones and appetite regulation. And what I wanted to do, I promise I'm not going to go over each hormone here that's listed, but you can see that there's quite a long list of gut hormones. And these are some of the main ones that can influence food intake and body weight. There's a few gut hormones that you may see that look a little bit familiar, and others that maybe not so much. But one thing I would mention here is that under this category to the right of the gut hormones on the left side of the screen, you'll see feeding. And when you see the arrow pointing down, that's saying that it is suppressing that feeding drive or suppressing the appetite. But let me call your attention to one specific item where it's ghrelin, and I circled that arrow because that is the only arrow that's pointing up, and that is the hunger hormone, if you will. And so ghrelin is affected by a few things, which I will touch on, but it goes up when your stomach is empty. It can also increase when your blood sugars are decreasing. So it is a pretty powerful one. And in fact, when I was listening to someone speak on the gut hormones, they said that when it comes to the hunger or hunger suppression, usually the gas pedal is always on, as in that drive of hunger, that ghrelin inspiration of wanting to eat seems to just shout a little bit louder than all these other ones to us. The other item that I circled, of course, is the GLP-1. which we will touch on the next slide. So you may already be familiar. The term GLP-1 is almost like a vocabulary word that we all know, even though it used to be unknown to many of us before these last few years. And so I wanted to touch on the influence of it. Firstly, GLP-1 is a naturally occurring gut hormone that's secreted shortly after we eat. So we already do have it in our bodies, it's created. And here are some of the differences though. The GLP-1 that we secrete is short lasting. So after we eat, you don't really feel hungry. And part of that is the effects of this GLP-1 because it does decrease appetite. It can slow gastric emptying, also increases insulin secretion, and has many other functions as well. But this is a matter of minutes, this GLP-1 that our body makes. But then we have these medications out there, and those maintain these appetite influencing effects much longer. So we're talking days instead of minutes. And that's why we can see the appetite influence at a much stronger level, lasting for much longer than just within a few minutes. But along with those gut hormones, we also have foods that can influence satiety. Like I mentioned earlier, the ghrelin, that gut hormone that inspires us to feel hungry, that level can go up when the stomach is empty. So we may ask ourselves, well, what foods can keep our stomach from emptying as quickly? And of course, gastric emptying is affected by food composition as well as volume. So liquids go through our gut much, much faster than solids. And a typical meal, it's been estimated that the stomach will empty completely about 4 or 5 hours after a typical meal. It does vary between people, and some people it may empty much more slowly, but this is just the general estimate. But remember, it seems like we're on the slower end when there's solid foods, and especially when it contains protein and or fat. Whereas carbs, namely simple carbohydrates, so we're talking the snacks, our candies, white bread, as well as liquids, are the quickest to go through. So you may remember that there was that tip of drinking water, a full glass of water before eating, so that way you can feel fuller. And there's nothing wrong with staying hydrated. I think that's great. But if anybody had tried it and felt like it was minimally effective at best, it was most likely because that water was getting through your system very quickly and not maintaining that gastric distension. Beyond that, though, beyond gastric distension and staying in the stomach longer, canned foods also have an influence on certain hunger hormones, and it seems like they can. And so I'm going to touch on that as well in the following slides. So of course, protein, you probably could guess that I was going to mention that first. And there were some studies, and of course, these are still continuing to be studied. When I was looking up more information and more current information on the science of satiety, the amount of journal articles that have been published on types of proteins and which ones are influencing our appetite more than others was abundant. But essentially, the intake of high protein meals seems to stimulate the release of some of those hunger-reducing hormones. And it seems like ideally, if at least 25% of your energy is in your meal is coming from protein, you should be able to see that hunger-reducing hormone effect pretty well. It also seems to help delay gastric emptying, so it will empty a little more slowly than if you didn't have protein in your meal. Moving on to fiber, it may help promote satiety in part by causing gastric distension. And in this parentheticals here, I listed the term plenty because honestly, I hadn't heard of the brand name before, a little bit over a year ago. And actually, I had thought it had been discontinued. It's not, it does still exist. But Plenity is a product that exists in pill form. It's referred to as a medical device, so not really a food, not a supplement, but it is made up of cellulose and citric acid. So when you ingest it, and also drink some water, it forms what they term as a hydrogel in the stomach. So we've got this cellulose, this fibrous type of carbohydrate material that expands and takes up space in your stomach, which promotes that feeling of fullness. And this is right before, the recommendations are to take it right before a meal so that you've already got your stomach somewhat full before you're eating. And the main concept is this idea of fiber helping your stomach feel fuller for longer. Also remember that high fiber foods are generally nutrient dense, like our vegetables, and they are also low calorie. So if part of your meal or a good portion of your meal is consisting of high fiber foods, you know you're going to be getting low calories, but a lot of nutrients, and hopefully feeling fuller for a longer period of time. But those aren't the only nutrients, of course. We can move on now to healthy fats. All fats can help slow down gastric emptying. So not just healthy fats, if you will. Of course, saturated fats can do this too. And when they're eaten along with fiber, it appears to help even more with that slowing of the gastric emptying. The reason why I call attention to healthy fats in particular is because general health would make that valuable. And the unhealthy fats, if you will, so trans fats, saturated fats, you'll often find in higher amounts with foods that are more processed. Also, when it comes to healthy fats, it looks like there may be some connection with fatty chain length. So if we have really long fatty chains, especially unsaturated fatty chains, that might influence those gastric hormones, those appetite suppressing hormones as well. And then moving on to complex carbohydrates. So not your white breads, not your candies, not your very simple carbs, but more whole grains, beans, those types of foods. They are slower to digest, and they can help, especially also in combination with all these other foods, they can help prevent the fall of your blood sugars, because as we established before, when your blood sugars start to fall, that's when we start to feel hungry again. Now, in doing my research and reading about the science of satiety, I came across a study that was actually done way back in 1995. So this was a journal article back in 1995 where they talked about something called the Satiety Index. And what they did was they measured foods and how people would rank them and into how much they would feel full. So which ones made them feel fuller? And they studied the amount of satiation or the feelings of fullness within 3 hours, and they really only studied a few foods. So we don't have a lot of reference points. So I think it's really important to mention that this is not a perfect satiety index or a perfect measure, because it's only comparing these foods and it's in specific amounts. However, I think this is a good baseline to show us what we can look at, and hopefully there will be more studies and more measurements of satiety with other foods, because you can see some interesting things that call to mind what we've talked about. You can see that the red meat and the white fish, those proteins, are higher than 100. You feel pretty full. Also for fats, they were looking at old cheddar cheese, poached eggs. Salted peanuts can still make you feel full-ish, but not quite to the same level as the other fatty type foods. And then we move on to carbohydrates that are more complex, if you will. So your muesli and some of these fruits. Potatoes surprised a lot of people because that is the highest ranked, and you would be hard pressed to find me recommend a whole bunch of potatoes at one of your meals. But we do know that potatoes are a complex carbohydrate and starchy, and that is a bit more difficult to digest if you're eating it in its whole form. And again, these are all comparing off of each other. What you will notice, though, is there's no non-starchy vegetables listed, and that would be really interesting to see that compared to all these other foods. But moving down, of course, to the hyperpalatable foods seems to have some of the lowest rankings. Your croissants in particular, as well as cake and donuts, all of these not very filling, not very satisfying. Potato chips also if you think about Pringles, or I think that's it, or Lay's, can't stop at just one. You can see where that comes into mind right here. Popcorn and butter, you know, if you're doing air popped popcorn, I would say that you're probably going to do pretty well in a general health and a healthier snack. And it does have a better satiety index here. So something I just wanted to mention, you can see where some comparisons happen. Now let's move on and talk about eating habits and feeling full based on our habits. So of course, balanced meals, I do encourage this for a lot of people because having protein combined with carbohydrates can be very helpful. And an area that I see this be a problem for most people tends to be in the mornings because cereals at breakfast are very common. I did that for most of my college years where it was cereal at breakfast. And I don't know about you, but I was starving before lunchtime. I was so very hungry. And that's because cereal is very basic and not a whole lot of balance there. So you want to try and end up with more protein. I've since changed to yogurt, usually Greek yogurt with some berries and muesli. But you have to do what works for you. Or, of course, there are some people who don't eat much for breakfast at all. But it's still about finding the balance whenever you do eat. Also, mindful eating. A lot of people talk about mindful eating, and there are many different ways to approach that. Hence why I put this little infographic here where it talks about putting the fork down between bites, slowing down, don't eat straight from packaging, even don't eat with your non-dominant or eat with your non-dominant hand, focusing on taste, and don't eat distracted, among many of these others listed here. And so doing that, being present at meals, and also think about and take the time to ask yourself, am I hungry? Or am I bored or feeling emotional? What's inspiring this hunger right now? Because it is important to eat when you're hungry, but a lot of times we confuse hunger with just feelings of boredom or out of habit. So if you can take that moment to pause and be mindful with your approach, that can help as well. And just remember, when you're slowing down while eating, that does give your body time to feel that fullness versus trying to eat all of it very quickly. So don't be in a rush. And we're already at the tail end here, but just to put things together here, remember that our hunger and our fullness cues, they are affected by many factors. So gut hormones or medications that act like our gut hormones are just one of those many factors. Also, knowing what foods can help maintain your satiety, that can help you whether or not you're taking GLP-1 medications. And then finally, remember to always focus on balanced meals and mindful eating approaches, even if it's a small amount, if it's a snack. Being balanced and having a mindful approach versus feeling rushed or eating without thinking, if you will, that can make us not experience that satiety the way that we would want. And with that, I wanted to open it up to any questions. So I will leave questions open for just a little bit here. Feel free again to hit that little question at the bottom of your screen if you have any, or about this topic or any other nutrition related topic. I'm happy to answer and hopefully enlighten you. And there we have it. Well, I hope you found this to be informative and enjoyable, and maybe have you thinking a little more about the way you want to make your meals to help feel fuller longer, or at least to know what might be affecting you in case you feel like you're feeling too full for too long. So hope you have a lovely rest of the evening, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.